Hello everyone, welcome back. I hope you all enjoyed your break, having a little chance to get some time away from the screen. It's really been great to hear from our presenters so far. As a Women's Aid network, we have so many examples. We've been doing some work with them, the network across Scotland, to look at some case studies. And we have so many examples, unfortunately, of domestic abuse killings of women and children who are not represented in statistics. So some of what Jane's talked about already, suicides after abuse, suicides after involvement with systems where women are feeling out of control and disempowered, deaths that are reported as accidents, and this is happening with women and children and young people. So it's so important that we talk about this. As a children's rights organisation, we are absolutely committed to addressing the invisibility of children and young people in research, in data and in policy, and this is one of the key areas that we see this happening in as a priority. So you'll have noticed that the title of our conference today is an international lens on domestic abuse killings. So though it's important that we talk about femicide and we talk about the deaths of women by men, it's also really important that we acknowledge that this is happening to children and young people as well. And that's why we talk about domestic abuse killings and not just femicide. Can everyone just check that they're on mute, please? Anne Trevorrow, can you put your camera off, please? So the speaker we're going to hear from next needs very little introduction, but we're going to hear from David Mandel, who is absolutely key in talking about some of these very issues. He is he's developed the Safe and Together model. He's the executive director and founder of the Safe and Together Institute. So that's a global domestic abuse systems change organisation working in North America, Europe, the Asia Pacific region, and Edinburgh and Scotland in particular hold a really special place in David's heart, as Edinburgh actually hosted the first international delivery of the Institute's core training, so the core 4-day Safe and Together training in 2014. So it's really awesome to have David here to speak with us. He's also currently working on a book related to the Safe and Together model, which will be released next year. But there's so many tools that the Institute offers that really support this work. So with no further ado, I'll hand over to you, David. Thank you.
Jody, thank you so much, and thank you everybody for inviting me to join, and thanks to Judy and for Marsha and everybody organizing it, and also honored to be on the panel with everybody else speaking, and was really moved and by the first speaker and Fiona. So thank you, Fiona, for sharing your and your daughter's story, and thank you, Jane, for your amazing work around domestic violence, homicide timelines, and the new work you're doing around preventing homicides and also hidden homicides. Really, I just tweeted on, as we do some work in the officer-involved domestic violence space, as the Institute has, that comes up there, police officers who are perpetrators staging murders to look like suicides. So that this is an important area to be paying attention to. As Jody says, I'm going to be speaking about children and the intersection of domestic violence killings, and adding, I think, just to the complexity of the conversation here about how what we think are homicides aren't the only homicides out there. I think will be a theme that I will continue through here to with my talk this afternoon. I'm going to just set up my timer so I can keep track of my time and sort of follow on Jane's excellent example about being very timely. So I'm going to pull up my slides, and hopefully this will be easy and not complicated to do. Jody, can my slides be seen?
They can indeed.
Okay, thank you. So I want to talk this morning about understanding and interrupting the multiple pathways to child death in the context of domestic abuse. And before I jump into that, with some of the ways I enter into this very challenging area, just a little bit about the Institute. For those of you who don't know it, we're as Jody said in introduction, we're an international organization. We don't do direct service. We're focused on professionals and improving systems responses to domestic violence, particularly where kids are involved. And really, what that means is getting systems to drop failure to protect as a paradigm, stopping mother blaming, and doing a pivot to the perpetrator as a parent in terms of their responsibility for the harm that they're caused. And you'll see that theme here as I talk about how we improve our response to child deaths related to domestic abuse. And there's just a tremendous amount, as Jody again said, the work we do. And I'll talk about our conference coming up in London in May 2023. But one of the highlights is we're collaborating with Luke and Ryan Hart and some other survivors around the world around uncovering coercive control toolkit that's coming out soon. And we do a lot of work in, again, as Jody said at the beginning, a lot of work in Scotland. We're really involved with almost all the local authorities. We're working closely with Scottish Women's Aid. We're working with other organizations and down south in England and Wales and even Northern Ireland. We're working with agencies. So you see here at the bottom, we have tons of partner agencies globally, and that number is going to jump up to, I think, 350 certified trainers by next year. But you get a feel for how much work we're doing in Scotland and the United Kingdom in general. And we're really proud of the training we deliver, the impact it's having. Very recently, for instance, we got a story out of a family court in Australia where the work we were doing with our certified trainers got a family court judge to reverse orders that had placed kids with a domestic violence perpetrator, and actually led to the magistrate apologizing to the mom for actually entering the initial order into place. So we get stories like that back from all over the globe all the time. And for those of you a little more visually oriented, just the range of work we do is kind of pictured here. And we do our work across a range of sectors now: family law, addiction, mental health, specialist family violence, child protection, health and home visitors, just really, you name it. So we're working with those sectors in terms of getting them to improve their practice. And in the UK, it's a tremendous number of local authorities. In Scotland, Ministry of Defence. We're working with a number of London boroughs right now on a major project that is a collaboration with Respect UK. So we're really committed to our partnerships in Scotland and in the United Kingdom in general. So for me, these are the major points that I'm going to be talking about. That domestic violence perpetrators are responsible for child deaths and near deaths through multiple pathways. And I'll be talking a little about that, in a minute. And there are certain system responses and ways of thinking that are making it harder for us to assess risk of child death from perpetrators, and we'll kind of identify that and talk about it. And there are steps we can take to prevent child deaths in this context. For me, when I was invited to speak about this, I started reflecting. I've been in the field and came in the doorway as a practitioner over 30 years ago, and started working with child protection systems 25 years ago or so. And my entry into that world was really through the murder of a child in the context of domestic abuse. And it was a child in the state of Connecticut, where I'm based in the US, who was murdered. It was a toddler who was murdered by her mother's boyfriend, who was also abusing her mom. And unfortunately, this is an extremely common scenario. Everywhere we work, they have these stories, unfortunately. And as we know, in many of these cases, to add insult to horrible injury, that victim parent can actually face bigger penalties in some cases than the perpetrating parent for failure to protect. And just a really reflection of the bias and the sexism in the system. And we know that when it comes to severe abuse of children and child deaths, the perpetrators are much more likely to be male than female. And so this kind of scenario is not unusual. I think it's one of the more common scenarios that I think people think about when they think about children and deaths related to domestic abuse. soon afterwards, kind of stepping into that world, was exposed also to a number of domestic violence child deaths that were in the child protection system, but were family court cases. And again, these are, post-separation cases are going through family court, and there was back-to-back in the span of a couple of months, two fathers who murdered their children during visits that were granted to them by family court. And one actually had driven all the way out of state up to Connecticut and actually had gone to a hearing and then took the kids right after the hearing and then murdered them. And so when we think about domestic violence deaths, I think relate to kids, I think these are some of the most dramatic and obvious examples. And much like Jane was talking about earlier, there's greater complexity, more unidentified deaths and near deaths that when we're talking about kids related to domestic violence than even this represents. And I remember being involved in case reviews. I'm thinking about two of them that are particularly poignant for me, about a male child whose dad was an alcoholic, who was also violent, and was identified as being at risk, needing counseling, the child needing counseling, which is very interesting. I'll talk about that in a minute. And this child was interfered with by the perpetrator getting the counseling. So here we have kind of this kind of, again, think about multiple pathways. It wasn't simply the abuse, but the fact that through the coercive control that the perpetrator of the violence, who was the child's father, could interfere with the child getting to counseling. And ultimately this child, over the course of a number of years, their mental health deteriorated as a result of the abuse, and they committed suicide. And so you see these kind of deaths of children that are domestic abuse caused, I would say, but that don't show up as a traditional homicide, just like we were hearing from Fiona earlier, and we're talking, Jane was speaking about this, that this extends to children as well. Another example, a girl who was whose dad had tremendous privilege and power in the community, again, in this case, post-separation, and she was court-ordered into counseling with him. And the therapist said the counseling wasn't good for her, and then the perpetrator bullied the therapist into restarting the counseling, and that was the final trigger for this girl's descent. Then ended in her suiciding as well. And when you look at this, you see the system's failures and breaks in the system, where the mental health practitioners who are working with her identified her as having trauma issues, but never named the person causing the trauma. They would talk about PTSD, they would talk about trauma, they suggested counseling, they identified that she was a child of an alcoholic, and that she needed to go to Al-Anon or needed to go to some support program for children of alcoholics, but never named the person causing the harm in the documentation, because I was involved with the case review, and never talked about the interventions that needed to happen with that perpetrating parent, because that was still ongoing, even though they weren't living together. And so there was a real issue in the siloing of the mental health system from the domestic violence system and from the safety system. Another kind of category of this, and could be talking about how many of the domestic violence associated deaths are neglect deaths. And I think when you look at this issue from the framework of child protection, child safety systems, we're really seeing the need to sort of, again, look deeper than sort of what is an obvious homicide to what are neglect deaths, what are labeled as neglect deaths, but are related to complex factors that are often caused or exacerbated by the perpetrator's domestic abuse and coercive control. And in this particular case, and this was a story shared with me with a colleague, and she talks about this publicly, but it really illustrates it, how her brother almost died from failure to thrive, because while her mom was breastfeeding her brother normally, that the abuse from the child's father, who's her stepfather, stripped all the nutrients out of the mom's breast milk. And there's research about the impact of of stress on the nutritional quality of breast milk, and cortisol, and increased cortisol, and what it happens when it goes into breast milk. So there's science behind this. And so in this case, this child almost died, and only because of medical intervention and kind of good health care did that not happen. And so when I think about near deaths, that's again really important. But if you again look at this through a gender lens, that we know that the focus in most cases is going to be on mom. What do you need to do? What are you not doing? You're the mother. And there's often not going to be that pivot to the perpetrator, that kind of assessment of the domestic violence, and how that's creating this near-death experience, for this child. And so when we think about this, again, we want to bring in these layers of understanding of the intersection between domestic violence perpetrators' behaviors and what it means for child well-being, to the point of abuse deaths or neglect deaths. And then, just to kind of throw this in as just for you to think about, it's not going to be a major point for this talk, but really, children of femicide victims, of domestic abuse homicides, what happens to them because of their one parent murdering another parent. And I was reading and familiarizing myself with some of the different ways systems are looking at this. In the Ofsted, sort of in England and Wales, the Ofsted system considers these kind of incidents serious injury to children, quote unquote, serious injury to children, and worthy a review of a serious incident review. Lots of systems don't. Lots of systems that are focused on child protection actually don't consider the murder of one parent by another parent a critical incident, or a review-worthy kind of learning experience, or something that is really kind of rise to the level of a direct child death or serious injury. And that really says something to us about how we silo our systems. And so it's really important to kind of be thinking about that again, as thinking about thinking about kids and homicide. That's another area. And there was another interesting thing that I think is worth considering is, I was looking at a 2017 femicide report out of the Republic of Ireland that covered 1996 to 2017. And they said out of 20 cases where women were killed by a male relative, not a partner or an ex-partner, 80% of those cases, it was their son who killed them. And while I don't know this, and the report didn't go into this level of detail, it's hard not to imagine that that those boys who committed the murder were also victims at some point of abuse by a male or another partner who's also abusing their mom. It's hard to imagine that not being the context. When you start exploring these kind of intersections with kids, for instance, kids in the U.S. U.S. juvenile justice system who are on juvenile probation, when I did some focus group work with their probation chiefs and sort of supervisors, they said 100% of our kids who are on our caseload for both status offenses and delinquency and violence and all sorts of other behaviors, 100% of those kids are coming from homes with domestic violence. And you'll see in some of this other data they'll share in a few minutes that it's connected up really, really tightly. So that's a little bit of kind of where I enter these conversations, which is that having done child death reviews, having reviewed cases, and had the horrible honor of looking and being part of teams and saying, how do we learn from this? What were the mistakes we made? And seeing all the places where practice could have been better. Hindsight is always 20/20, as they say, but always putting myself in the position of that practitioner and saying, what is reasonable to expect from that practitioner at the point in time they touch the case? And what can we ask them to get better at? And better at language and better at ways we're going to talk about things. I'm thinking about one case where, for instance, the language constantly gets sanitized, or the violence constantly gets sanitized in report writing. And this was a case where, all it said in the documentation were threats were made. But it didn't illuminate what the specific threats were. And so you start thinking about all the different ways the language we use makes it harder to actually identify risk. And this is true in adult homicides and also child homicides as well. And so I'm going to be talking this through with you a little bit as we go through the afternoon. So there is, for me, one of the touchstone reports, and if you want to get access to, because I don't think it's online anymore, I don't know if it is, it's out of New South Wales. It's at what used to be called their Family and Community Services Department, so New South Wales in Australia. And in 2012, they did a child death 2012 annual report, Learning to Improve Services. And it continues to be, as I kind of go back and forth to it, so it's a little bit old at this point, one of the best looks at child deaths in the context of domestic abuse as it sits or are known to the child protection system. And so again, this is a different angle that a lot of times we're often looking, at the deaths of kids in the context of the murder of their moms. And this is coming at it from a different angle, which is looking at kids known to child protection and looking at over about 5 years. And what they found was, so the first thing they found was that 61% of the children that were known to child protection, which meant they had an open case at one point in the last 12 months, or was open at the time of the death, was that that 61% of those cases had domestic abuse in the family history. And the data is always sort of how, when you look at the stuff and say family history or present domestic violence, you always have to be looking at sort of what the definition is. And the definition in this report isn't clear, but what they're saying is it was present in the case file, it was identified. And if, for those of you who don't know, the estimates, that I get from folks in the field, that consistently in cross geographic regions is domestic abuse is a relevant factor in almost 80% of child protection cases. That doesn't mean there's an active danger right now, but it may be impacting still the family functioning, for instance. And so 61% of those cases showed up with domestic abuse. And the vast majority of those cases, just like the vast majority of child protection cases in general, were neglect cases. So a lot of these cases were not what we think about as the traditional domestic violence child homicides, where it was beating death or stabbing death, or something that clearly is identified as a homicide. These are presenting as Jane said earlier about sort of adult deaths, sort of in ways that are suspicious, that are considered maltreatment deaths, or maybe it's not clear that the cause of death exactly, or who even caused the death. But the belief is that this was related to some form of neglect or abuse. And so for me, that really stands out as something very important. And what they found, and this is why this report is so nuanced, they did a lot of comparisons and really basic descriptive work about saying, that when we looked at these cases where there was domestic violence as a factor and compared them to the other cases where there are child deaths, where there was no known domestic violence, that you see that there's an increased rate, some places very significant, of overlapping other forms of child maltreatment. So these kids are not just being impacted by domestic violence perpetrators' behavior, but they are also experiencing higher levels than the other group of physical abuse, emotional abuse, physical neglect, medical neglect, and sexual abuse. And this shouldn't come as a surprise, because part of the challenge we know this, but our systems haven't necessarily caught up with it, is knowing that, for instance, domestic violence perpetrators' behavior towards adult survivors very much involves the kids. And I'll talk about the language challenges, child witness, children exposed to domestic violence makes it harder for us to fully understand the way domestic violence perpetrators involve kids, target kids, use kids, impact kids' functioning, and really, again, if you start thinking about functioning, you begin to see the outline of that pathway to neglect deaths. That sort of if my violence is degrading the family functioning, is creating homelessness, is creating increased risk of drug abuse and addiction or mental health issues in my partner, is stripping away support networks, is getting my partner involved with criminal justice system. We all know on this call the multitude of ways that perpetrators' behavior degrades the function or can degrade the function of the adult survivor, but the children and the family functioning overall as well. And so you see this here, but it comes even more clearly with this. This is different numbers even. So the first slide I just showed you was about maltreatment, which is the formal definitions. This is about intersecting issues. Same format. The first number is the cases with the child death with the domestic violence was a case factor, and so again you see here, things that are at more than for everything, more than double the rate of these other issues. So this data is correlative, right? And it's just descriptive, just saying, when we looked at these cases, these were the characteristics of these cases versus those cases. But we can begin to sort of think about, because we know how domestic violence perpetrators' behaviors impact families, that it's really hard to not believe that it's the perpetrator's behavior that is tied in or exacerbating or increasing substance abuse, because we know that survivors self-medicate, for instance, that we know that that survivors are going to have higher trauma rates and mental health rates than non-survivors, that we know there's a tie-in to poverty and homelessness and transience, that survivors, even when they're trying to flee or go into refuge or kind of find a safe home, just again, that there can be constant impact by the perpetrator who constantly disrupts normal functioning. And so it's really, for me, when I look at this, really hard not to see, one, the fingerprints of the perpetrating parent on these numbers. And two is, again, to see that pathway or those pathways to neglect deaths or child deaths in that way. And one of the reports that I was looking at, I can't remember which one it was really fascinating, because again, the way we obscure the responsibility of the perpetrator is really cumulative. It's very serious, and I hope you kind of share my interest in sort of unpacking these things, or kind of questioning these things, or asking, when people make a laundry list of issues, well, this family has mental health and homelessness and domestic violence, and just kind of list it as a laundry list of problems, that we slow down and we ask the question, we name the perpetrator, and then we ask questions about how did the perpetrator cause or contribute to the family's homelessness. But instead, one of the reports used the language of saying, well, the kids were experiencing a quote unquote toxic caregiving environment, which involved domestic violence, mental ill health, substance misuse, learning disabilities. And so what happens is that sort of that we dump all these things into one garbage can, and we just sort of say, well, this family has a lot of problems, and then let's give them services for each of these issues. Let's send the mom to her mental health program, the dad to his substance misuse program. Let's make sure that we can stabilize their housing. Let's give the kids into counseling. And that oftentimes that siloed approach does not contribute to perpetrator accountability, naming the perpetrator's behavior. When mom drops out of her substance use program, we don't name that it was his sabotage that caused it. When the kid drops out of counseling or doesn't go to counseling, we say mom and the child became non-compliant with counseling. And so again, there's such an important need here that in looking at this issue, that we need to be able to see the way that domestic violence perpetrators' behavior. And again, many of you who've worked with the Safer Together model are familiar with this particular way of languaging things, which is to say that it's not that the domestic violence harming kids, but it's domestic violence perpetrators' behavior harming children or interfering with the mom's parenting or impacting the children's function in this way is really so critical to domestic violence informed practice, is to name the person and name the behavior and name the impact of the behavior. And so if you're reading reports or looking at things that don't name the person engaging the behavior, don't name the specific behaviors, and then don't name the impact of those behaviors, it's going to be harder to interrupt that person's power over the rest of the family, and it's going to be harder to prevent downward spirals that might lead to death in a number of different formats, whether it's suicide, whether it's a neglect death, or whether it's a clearly identified homicide. And so for me, when I look at these numbers and there's greater complexity, one of the ways to cut through that greater complexity is to really start, again, using that perpetrator pattern-based approach to make sure that it's being described in this way. And this is one of the, when we look at, I'll kind of come back to this, when we talk about risk assessment frameworks that separate out, let's say, a survivor's mental health issues or addiction issues as a risk factor and decontextualize that from the perpetrator's behavior may not be fully serving our needs. Risk assessment frameworks that don't describe harm to children or look at behaviors towards children as well as the behaviors to the adult survivor may also be making it harder for us to interrupt with pathways down to children's deaths, for instance. So this greater complexity really requires us to up our game in terms of our practice and how we approach things. So when we think about the systems issues, the barriers and broken links, I mean, there's a lot of them, and these are the ones that kind of rise to the top for me. That things to be looking at, and so the first one is this narrow definition of intersection of domestic abuse and children, and the most common way this shows up. Is in the language we use in terms of children exposed to domestic violence or child witness to domestic violence, and each of those terms makes the perpetrator invisible and also really narrows the nexus between the kids and the domestic violence perpetrator's behavior, and so really we need these wider lenses, this more inclusive assessment framework that I've been talking about, which really speaks to asking the question, what's the domestic violence perpetrator's pattern of coercive control and actions taken to harm the kids, and how those things impacted the child's functioning, the other parent's functioning, and the family's functioning. Because if we're looking at the needs of kids, and we're also trying to understand the impact on the adult survivor actually as well, that impact on family functioning, which is so far beyond the trauma framework, this is so much bigger than the traditional trauma framework, is, for instance, if my violence has caused an eviction from the family home, then there's a whole cascade, or even if it forces a shift to refuge and new housing, that's such a motion, a cascade, an avalanche of different factors that are going to impact children from being in a new school, from being in an unfamiliar environment, all these different things that may contribute to difficulties in mental health, for instance, of kids. But again, those things get decontextualized from the perpetrator's pattern, again, making it harder to name that person as the source, maybe making it harder to give the kids the services they need, those kind of things. So again, shifting that language away from failure to protect, from children exposed to domestic violence or child witness. So that's which limit this. Separate systems examining femicides, domestic intimate partner violence deaths, and child deaths. Again, in the US context, for sure, those systems have grown up separately. They're two distinct systems, and they don't often communicate with each other or look at the opposite issue or the other issue in depth as much as they can. In a lot of cases, the domestic violence perpetrator is involved with both the death of the adult survivor and the child. And so this becomes a barrier to greater understanding, greater learning. And again, the challenges, we have siloed systems and siloed conversations sometimes about intimate partner violence and child maltreatment, and oftentimes they're linked through the perpetrator's behavior. So again, those separate systems become barriers. Similar to what Jane was speaking about earlier, the challenge that a lot of neglect deaths don't fit the definition of criminal homicide. So they're not looked at fully, they're not learned from, they're not identified. You could have somebody moving from one family to another, not having been identified as somebody who committed murder and then going on to perpetrate it again. So again, this sort of this challenge of systems that are really not fit for purpose. Domestic violence risk assessment processes that aren't sufficiently inclusive of risk and harm to kids. And so again, looking at major risk assessment frameworks, asking yourself, how well do they include kids, risk to kids as through pathways, particularly post-separation, risk to kids posed through family court involvement, child protection systems. Is it labeling or identifying the actual harm to kids, or just identifying a factor, violence during pregnancy as a risk factor for future homicide or severe violence? Very important, but it doesn't necessarily tell you everything you need to know to assess the risk to the child, for instance. Failure to protect culture, which keeps us focused on survivor parents versus perpetrating parents, is such a huge issue, and why we don't get this right. Because over and over again, we're looking to usually the moms to protect and holding them culpable when professionals deem that they haven't protected. And all that keeps the focus away from the perpetrator's parent, reinforced by the idea that systems are really not good at engaging men, working with men as parents, holding them accountable as parents, reflective of low standards for men as parents in the wider society. As kind of captured by terms like when refer to men as babysitting for their own children. But over and over again in reports related to child deaths, and this New South Wales report is one of those, for instance, is this identification of workers being scared of working with men, feeling unskilled, not feeling confident, and that really contributing to poor practice in this area, and again, ultimately contributing to an environment where we may not be interrupting behavior that could lead to the death of a child, because we're just not engaging that person, and we're not identifying them as a problem. Engagement could be interviewing, assessing, working more closely with the courts, any number of different areas. And so that leads to the absence of work with fathers. And then I've mentioned the siloed mental health, substance misuse, and domestic abuse. And so again, in the mental health framework, to really ask, or the substance misuse framework, and we're doing more work in this area with the Ministry of Health in New South Wales. We're doing it with a dedicated substance misuse program in Victoria and Australia as well. But really sort of breaking down those silos. How do you break down those silos so that when adult and child survivors are showing up with mental health and or substance misuse issues, that conversation is not siloed from the conversation about safety. It's not siloed from the conversation about, is anybody interfering with you accessing this treatment? It's not siloed from discussing whether the perpetrator's undercutting the efficacy of those treatment efforts. It's not separating out from are these allegations or issues being weaponized in family court or in child protection by reports being made by the perpetrator who is using systems to extend their control. And so all these things become cumulative when these gaps kind of are allowed to persist. They become cumulative, and so you can see that a child who is having a response to the violence, is having behavioral issues, is having mental health issues, and is not being validated, supported, and as Jane said, advocated for by professionals, by systems, is not being protected from the ongoing control and abuse by the perpetrator, that it's easy to see that their slide would continue towards depression, suicidality, engaging in aggressive behaviors, repeating patterns. I mean, so all the things that kind of laid out at the beginning of the talk were really that all those things kind of are the complexity that if we want to reduce or stop child deaths in the context of domestic abuse, we have to look at all these systems and all these issues as they kind of work or don't work together. And so part of the, when we talk about what the answer is or how we can make this better, there's some basic steps that we've been seeing played out across the world as we do work with systems based on the Safer Together model. So I'm really embedding this kind of idea that domestic violence perpetration is a parenting choice, whether the children are there to witness it or not. So it really supports this wider definition and really starts putting into context the a person who abuses, their behavior as being responsible for what it's doing to the kids. You know, if the violence leads to mom not being able to go to work and that causes her to lose her job, that impacts the kids. That's a parenting quote unquote choice that the perpetrator is making, which means that they're responsible for those negative effects. And to name those things are not only so important for the safety and well-being of the kids, but also for the validation of the adult survivor, who's often going to feel very guilty and ashamed and feel responsible, because gender bias is training us to have lower expectations for men as parents and higher expectations of women as parents. That internalized kind of expectation, will lead survivors many times to feel guilt and shame about what the perpetrator is doing to the kids. And so by adopting this clarity, we create more space for survivors' disclosures, more space for validating their protective efforts, and shift the responsibility of particularly child serving systems to look at the perpetrator and their choices, not the survivor and her choices as the cause of the harm to the kids. Wanted to give you a visual just about sort of what this wider, more comprehensive sort of framework of really assessing harm, and really thinking about what is that perpetrator's pattern behavior. And this is why, so important the advances have been made in Scotland, England, and Wales around coercive control laws. And we're always talking about the Scottish law being a gold standard globally for coercive control, as there are conversations going on in Australia and other places. We've brought Marsha in to talk about coercive control, and so the process of getting that law passed and contextualizing it to local context, but just so important to really, when we look at those behaviors and we're thinking about kids and their well-being, that we need to be looking at that pattern of coercive control. And one of the things that kind of comes to the top of my mind is, even from prison, this one perpetrator who had told his son not to listen to his mom, to be a good son to dad, and also was saying to his son, don't take medication. Medication is going to make you crazy. So this was a child who was suicidal and depressed. And so again, we want to name the way perpetrators create these conditions or foster vulnerability or foster danger, even if that danger doesn't end up leading to be what we would consider homicide. Here you have a parent who is undercutting his kid's severe mental health needs for his own ends. And so we need to be able to name those things. And one of the barriers, again, to naming them, particularly when it's a male perpetrator and a female victim, is that we're often much more focused on mom's parenting behaviors than we are on dad's parenting behaviors. And we have to kind of keep pushing ourselves to shift that around and not get stuck in that gender bias trap. This is, while this isn't specific to child deaths, this is one of the core parts of what we teach in a lot of our trainings, is really this idea of understanding that while a lot of times that sort of middle section, children's trauma and safety, is a lot of what we talk about when we talk about perpetrators' impact on kids, which is so critical, that really, if we want to do a comprehensive assessment of harm to kids, that this moves us closer. I mean, this doesn't encompass everything, but moves us closer. And so you begin to see that with this as a backdrop, that if perpetrators, we're starting to name that perpetrators are degrading the family ecology and connections and supports and disrupting education and causing poverty and housing instability, and then interfering with a survivor's ability to parent and causing multiple consequences for them, that you begin to see how the conditions for a neglect death start getting created. And it becomes really hard for systems, the way they're currently set up, to sort of tell that story and say, wait a second, this is tied back to this father or stepfather or boyfriend's behavior in these ways. This is the way they interfered with mom going to counseling. This is the way they interfered with a child going to counseling. This is the way they interfered with mom raising the child and parenting the way that she wanted to. I mean, I still remember a survivor who said to us recently, he interfered with me being the parent I wanted to be. And in a particular case, again, I'm thinking about, again, developmental issues. This case comes to mind where a child was delayed in their gross motor skills, and the pediatrician was very explicit with mom that this child needs more tummy time to develop his gross motor skills. And so the problem was that the father child who was abusing her said, no, my child will not go on the floor. And you either have to be holding the child, he dictated, or the child needs to be in the crib. The floor was clean. This was not a dirty house. And so here you see what is very kind of would not rise to anybody's level of severity of violence or control but controlling to the level of parenting, ignoring medical professionals, ignoring what kids' needs are, and creating problems. Another case where the child had cerebral palsy, and he was interfering with her getting the medical attention, the support, the new braces as she grew. So again, wanting to start helping people see these very tangible connections with children's functioning getting derived from the perpetrator's coercive control. And so you have that, and so again, having that map of how that might lead to severe degradation of child's functioning and neglect scenarios that might ultimately lead to a child's death. And this is always a good rubric. It's I think it's the last slide I'm showing out of the model, but it's good rubric to sort of, this could be adult or child survivors issues. Are they being caused by the perpetrator's behavior? So is the kid's behavioral issues being caused by the perpetrator's behaviors? Are the kids' medical issues? Are the developmental delays being caused? Are pre-existing issues being exacerbated by the perpetrator's behavior? And then really so important is the perpetrator interfering with support systems, care systems, medical care systems, counseling systems. What's the perpetrator doing to interfere with those things? And we are doing more and more work, and it's not really part of this presentation, but about how perpetrators are manipulating systems and really interfering with systems, doing their job, being supportive, focusing on kids' needs. We're doing that in Family Law Court. We're just in the middle of a multi-year project with the National Family Law Court in Australia around applying the model in family law cases. We're doing this really across systems. We're doing it with mental health and addiction systems in Australia. And so really this model, because if we're going to affect, sort of this maltreatment deaths related to kids, or we're going to affect domestic violence homicides to children and to adult survivors, it's got to be across systems. It can't just be one system. This can't just be the criminal justice system. There's so much work that needs to be done in the NGO sector, mental health, substance misuse, particularly housing, all these different areas, particularly because they feed into these statutory systems. And as we know, that when we get suicides from domestic violence survivors, for instance, they're not only usually responding to the perpetrator's behavior, but the lack of support and assistance they're getting from other people. That feeling of trapped, there's no way out except to kill myself, is a product often of multiple factors, not just the individual behavior of the perpetrator, but of the collusion or the lack of support, or sometimes the worsening of the scenario by the response of people outside, formally or informally. So it's so important to name and keep naming the perpetrators' behaviors and their role, and how they're targeting systems, how they're interfering with care, how they're manipulating, how they're calling and making false reports. So if I'm making false reports to the police or false reports to child protection, that often means that the victim parent may not feel safe to call those systems for help. So again, the entrapment gets exacerbated. And again, if we can draw a pretty straight line from entrapment and feelings of entrapment to suicide as a form of both adult and child deaths. I thought I'd give you this a little bit stretch for this session, but I thought it might give you a feel for some of the ways that we're trying to work through the complexity and really trying to understand and hold perpetrators accountable and the way we approach these things. And so this is about the intersection of addiction issues and perpetrators' coercive control. And it really tries to break down the fact that perpetrators are often targeting multiple people in their attacks using real or alleged substance misuse by their partner. Sometimes it's totally fabricated. And what you can imagine what this does to the adult survivor and to the children, but you see on the left-hand side these statements that perpetrators make, and again, they're all about substance abuse, but they're slightly different for the audience. They're tailored slightly different for the audience, and they attack slightly different things, but they're clearly overlapping things, you know. So sometimes the attack is on the survivor's sense of self and ability to reach out for help. Some it's on the mom and child relationship. Some it's on the survivor support network. You know, some involves manipulating systems, really trying to center the perpetrators, all the different levers they're pulling on to entrap adult and child survivors, and then all the potential effects on that target, on the child and family functioning. You can see that, you know, how these things, again, if we're thinking about suicide, for instance, how these things would contribute to that, to those outcomes. And so this is really critical. And so again, if you have sort of you look at the bottom right-hand corner, children removed from survivor, placed with dangerous parent. We hear from survivors all the time that the removal of their children by child protection was the thing that removed the one thing they were living for, and would often precipitate a downward spiral around mental health, around substance misuse, and other things, again, ending in some instances in suicide. And so this is, you know, so again, so trying to paint a picture and showing you the level I think we need to get to. If we're really going to break this apart and start holding perpetrators more accountable, we need to name these things. And again, I'm going second or third, you know, in a conference like this, get the reference back to other people. And Jane's saying kind of talking about Evan Stark, naming this. Raising the profile of this is so important to change. So what are some of the actions?
You've got 3 minutes.
Thank you, Marcia. This is almost the very end. So these are, I've talked about a lot of these things, you know, but you know, in terms of action steps, change our language, pivot to the perpetrator, use a more holistic assessment, drop failure to protect models, break down silos, assess more for post-separation risk to kids, which is a huge area. You know, when children's focus systems are doing serious case reviews, include homicides of parents where the children are not physically hurt, killed in those serious case reviews, to start gathering data on those scenarios where there's a domestic abuse homicide where kids are impacted, obviously, but to learn more about those, to kind of break down the silos between those two systems, more actively examine risk to children as part of multi-agent risk assessments, and greater communication between child and femicide death review processes. It would be really important as well. So these are the things that, you know, that sort of thinking about in my mind today that would be steps forward. If people want to learn, we're hoping our mapping tool that's coming out really soon will help with these kind of things, to help organize people's thinking. That's about to come out in the next couple of weeks. I mentioned this tool coming out later with Luke and Ryan Hart in 2023. And if people haven't tuned into our podcast, Partner with Survivor covers a lot of these topics more in depth, free, online, available right now. And then we've got our conference coming, first in-person conference in the UK since COVID, in May of 2023. And here is the ways to reach us, including me on Twitter, Safe and Together on Twitter, and my email. So how did I do, Marcia? Did I land it in the 3 minutes? That is it.
You did so much better than I did in your conference. Well done.
And so people should feel free to reach out to me afterwards with any questions, or they want that New South Wales report, which is a really useful report.
It also reminds me of actually quite an old study now from the homicide in Britain study that was done by the Doboshes, which identified that one of the, I think the top two predictors of the murder of a woman in a domestic abuse case was the presence of a child in the family that was not biologically linked to the perpetrator. And I think that we often really miss some of the research that's out there and the data that's out there because of that silo you're talking about between children and the non-offending parent, otherwise known as the mother in our world, pretty much. And I have about 17 more things I would love to bring out of your presentation. I will be doing a little bit of a sum up at the end. But everybody, please do, if you have questions or comments for David, forward them to David or to us, and we will be very happy to share them.
Thank you for having me today.
Absolutely. And I should just point out that we are a Safe and Together training organization. So
that's very true. Yes, thank you.
Thank you, David. It's now my pleasure to introduce Kirsty Spencer. And let me just get my notes so that I don't mess this up. Kirsty Spencer's sister, 6 years ago, Kirsty Spencer's sister Dawn was killed by her estranged husband in the former family home. Dawn's husband claimed he acted in self-defense after Dawn flipped, quote unquote, during an argument, and he was cleared of her murder. Since Dawn's killing, Kirsty has campaigned relentlessly to profile and address all the continued failings that result in the deaths of women and children, so many of which we've heard about today. We are really privileged to have Kirsty with us today to highlight how we must work together to ensure that no more precious lives are lost. Thank you, Kirsty. And I'm assuming we have Kirsty on here. Somebody tell me if we don't.
Kirsty was here a second ago, so I'm hoping she's just having problems putting her camera on or something.
Well, Kirsty, we're waiting for you, hon, but no worries, because God knows we've had enough tech problems already today. So we are not the first ones to point the finger, I gotta say. I will just point out that the worst tech problem I ever had was when I was presenting in David's conference in Australia in the middle of the night, 3 o'clock in the morning, can I say? And the Prime Minister in Australia decided then that he was going to announce a COVID lockdown, and the internet broke and we were all left hanging. Anyway, Kirsty, I think I saw you there for a minute.
Yeah.
There we go. There we go. Hi, Kirsty. Can you put your camera on?
I'm on my phone because my Mac has given up.
I'm so sorry.
This is a technical nightmare today. Can you see me at all? No.
No, we can hear you a little. We can hear you, but you're kind of going in and out. Can you join us later and we can see if we have Police Scotland on hand? We could see if they could go up next.
Yeah, sure, no problem. I'll see if I can sort something out.
All right, wait, don't go away because that might not work. That was just a bright idea that might not be so bright.
Okay.
Jody and Judy, do we have the wondrous Sam Foles here yet? Oh, there she is.
We do indeed,
Hey, Sam.
and she appears like a knight in shining armor.
There she goes. So, Kirsty, if you we'll give you I think we got about 20 minutes or 15 or 20 minutes, and then feel free to reconnect with us and let's see if we can make it work a little better. If not, we'll use you on your phone because we would rather have you on your phone than not at all. Okay.
Thank you.
All right. So Jody has the introduction for Sam, and Jillian. Is Jillian with you, Sam? Sam? Hi, Jillian.
She's here.
Okay. Hi. But I will just do it here because I'm just always rolling with the punches here. So, but also it takes no big stretch for me to introduce Sam. Sam has been a guiding light in Police Scotland since the time that I started doing domestic violence work here in Scotland, which was almost 20 years ago. No, it was 20 years. Oh my God, it was more than 20 years ago. Anyway, there's just no more important role than having allies in public sector, especially institutions who get it, who get domestic abuse, who get it. And my experience also is that if you look at who when you're working in the community who get domestic abuse, other than the women working in organizations like Assist and Women's Aid, the people who get it the best, besides survivors, are the enlightened police officers who see it every day. So, and they make such a difference in our world, in women's families and children's families. And Sam, I know you've been battling the good fight in Police Scotland all along. So thank you so much for joining us today. And Jillian, you too, I assume we're going to get to see you. And just go for it.
Thanks, Marsha. You've just reminded me that I've got almost 30 years on the police, so I feel ancient now.
Oh, listen, you're younger than I am, honey.
I'm also going to try and share a slideshow, but I'm a bit of a technophobe, so I'll do my best here, Marsha.
You are not a technophobe. You'll be fine.
Okay. I don't know that it's actually going to let me share. Oh, it might. Okay. Can you see?
Yep. Yes, we can.
Can you see the slideshow now?
Yeah, we can see it.
All right, okay. So good afternoon, everybody, and firstly, thanks very much for providing us the opportunity to represent Police Scotland and hopefully provide a little tiny bit of Scottish context around what we've been hearing and our approach to tackling domestic abuse, and in particular, our response to domestic homicides. And Marsha, I'm grateful for the invitation and the opportunity to hear the other speakers and all the great work that's going on. And I suppose in particular, Fiona, I would recognise Fiona. I'm well aware of the circumstances of Emily's death, and even being aware of them and this, you know, a couple of years later, it still very much resonates with me personally, Emily's circumstances of her death. So in Scotland, what is a domestic homicide? We've heard a lot of terms and a bit of jargon today, so I thought it might be helpful if I just explain it. So homicides committed when one human being is killed by another. Culpable homicide, where the death is intentionally caused in circumstances which are neither murderous nor justifiable, so thus a death that's inflicted immediately following severe provocation, or in such circumstances of self-defence don't fully justify it. Yeah.
What we see is your slide, is your PowerPoint slides with all the slides on the left, but I suspect you meant to move. There you go. That's better. So, and but we might be at the end there because that's what we have is a gray slide.
Ah, right. Okay. Hang on. Is that what you see? Right. Yeah. I'll bring it up the other page. I told you I was a technophobe.
Well, Teams is not very friendly a place to present on, I have to say.
Can you see it now?
No, but what we can see is assistance to contact the IT service desk in Police Scotland, I think. Do you have a, you can even just pull it up on your PowerPoint as long as you're changing your slide.
I can see the slides now.
Yep. No. Okay. What is domestic homicide is pulled up. That's mine.
You see it now?
Yep.
Right. Okay. Well, I have to work with that one. So, murder, I think we got to murder, didn't we? So murder is committed when a human being is killed without necessary cause. In order to constitute the crime, there must be an intention to kill or a willful act so reckless as to show the person who committed it was utterly regardless of the consequence. So we've heard today about the tremendous amount of work ongoing across the UK and internationally. And in the absence of a speaker from COPFIS, Marsha, I'm not sure we've got a speaker from Fiscal Service. I might take the opportunity to just highlight some of the small differences in Scotland in the process, and in particular in the investigation of deaths. So I can't comment on the process in England and Wales or anywhere else, But what I can tell you is that in Scotland, the Scottish Fatalities Investigation Unit are the specialist team within the Crown Office and Procurator Fiscal Service, and they're responsible for the investigation of all deaths that are sudden, suspicious, accidental or unexplained, and that includes children. And last year, trying to improve our response and recognise the impact of domestic homicide, I increased the age limit for the appointment of a specially trained child death senior investigating officer to investigate all child deaths in Scotland that are reportable, up to and including 16 and 17-year-olds. So when a child dies in Scotland and it's a reportable death, and that means that there's no immediately identified or pre-existing cause, a child death SIO will task lines of investigation to identify known risk factors, but that includes a history of domestic abuse or any existing child protection concerns, and the full circumstances and background will be reported to the Fiscal. And on every occasion of a reportable death in Scotland, police inquiries are led by the Fiscal Service, and where there's a sudden or unexplained death, and for example a partner agency attends, like the Scottish Ambulance Service, we routinely alert the police, generally before their arrival, so that there's a joint response from the outset. And I've noted everything that's been said, Marsha, in terms of suicides that are related to domestic abuse, and I think it's a key thing that we're looking at with our colleagues in partnership prevention and community wellbeing to look at suicides. What I can say is every suicide in Scotland is investigated by the police, and the CID are notified to ensure that appropriate crime scene management and all lines of inquiry and evidential opportunities are captured to allow the full circumstances to be reported. And I think even since we became Police Scotland, we're still trying to improve that response. And the Fiscal in Scotland, obviously we don't have a coroner. The Fiscal is responsible for instructing post-mortem examinations in Scotland. And from my own personal experience, and Marcel knows how passionate I can get about doing this, I hopefully can provide a degree of reassurance that where a suicide occurs, all the police systems are interrogated. And if there's a domestic history identified at all, then I instruct further scrutiny and police inquiries to ensure now that there's nothing suspicious. And that's based on the learning from people like Fiona feeding back into us what's happened. In terms of prevalence, since the inception of Police Scotland in April 2013, we have had 86 domestic homicides in Scotland. That's an average of 9 domestic murders per year. And on average, there's a total of 60 murders in Scotland every year. So domestic homicides make up 15% of that total. The detection rate for domestic homicide in Scotland is 100%, but that's not the measure of success that we're striving for. That's 86 people that have lost a life. So the ultimate aim for us is no domestic homicides. But this, like all other aspects of policing domestic abuse, is about prevention, education and support. And ultimately, it's not something that policing can achieve in isolation. We can't do it alone as an organisation, and we certainly can't police our way out of this. And that's why events like today are so important and something that we're delighted to have been included in and contribute to, because victims rely on a really strong multi-agency response. There can be unique challenges investigating domestic homicides in Scotland, and it's generally not about evidence gathering, because we always know who the perpetrator is. It's about the impact on families and children. 88% of domestic homicides take place indoors, which of course limits the opportunity for area independent witnesses. And there are lists there on the slides about what the majority of weapons are. Motives can be really diverse and difficult to identify initially. And we know that there is significant underreporting in terms of domestic abuse. So for us, it's about intelligence sharing, it's about targeting serial perpetrators and preventing further future abuse, and to ensure that victims and survivors are supported. There's often a sense of frustration in the police service when we're investigating domestic homicide, because we absolutely recognise that it's often preventable, and that 2 sets of families are invariably impacted. And particularly where there's children involved, they effectively lose both parents at the same time. So domestic homicides are really a motive, not just for families and communities, but for the officers that respond, because we need to remember that they do recognise the wider impact, and when they take the oath of office, so when we all swore as officers to uphold the law, we didn't suddenly set aside the role of being a public citizen. So we are not immune to what happens outside the organisation, and we don't always get our response right. We do try, but we acknowledge that there's much more to be done. But since the inception of Police Scotland, we've retained and maintained that focus on domestic abuse, and it remains an organisational priority for us. So in 2019, we conducted some analytical work around domestic homicides in Scotland, and we looked at the period 1st of April 2013 to March 2019, and there were 56 homicides during that period. What did we learn? Unfortunately, nothing surprising. We learned that domestic homicide disproportionately affects women in Scotland. 74% of victims were female and 82% of perpetrators were male. From the most prominent age group of perpetrators was 51 to 60 years, and the most prominent age for victims was 41 to 50 years. 10 of those homicides were what we have referred to, and we've heard it today, as murder-suicides. 8 of the suicides were completed in the immediate aftermath after the murder, and 2 took place whilst the accused was awaiting trial. And in all instances of murder-suicide, the perpetrator was male. In a further 5 incidences, the male perpetrator attempted suicide immediately after the homicide. But recognising that it's preventable, Police Scotland's approach to tackling domestic abuse and preventing homicides has evolved, and I'd like to take just a minute or two to outline the operational response to domestic abuse in Scotland. Homicides are commonly, but not always, preceded by episodes of domestic abuse and violence, so interventions we know it's possible to prevent fatal outcomes. We've made significant progress in recent years to tackle it and intervene earlier to protect victims and their families, but as I said, we also recognise absolutely there is much still to be done. At an operational level, we have a perpetrator-focused and victim-centred approach. Our 3-tiered response to domestic abuse in Scotland provides a structure to uniform officers, local and national specialist resources, and our approach ensures that regardless of the community or the individual's background or circumstances, victims in Scotland are afforded a response that's tailored to their individual needs. Tier 1 is our local policing response, which is made up of officers and staff across Scotland, working with local communities to support victims and bring domestic abuse perpetrators to justice. But one of the key challenges faced by the Tier 1 response is volume and demand. We've seen an average of 65,000 domestic abuse incidents in the last year, and that equates to between 150 and 170 incidents reported to us every single day, and we know that's underreporting. Each incident takes on average 9 hours to resolve, and at least 40% of those incidents, officers identified at least one crime. So officers are trained to respond to and identify domestic abuse, but realistically, as you can imagine, that scale of demand might impact on the time and commitment that they actually want to give to victims. Tier 2 or domestic abuse investigation units are committed to undertaking investigations into more serious, complex or higher risk inquiries, and these are the specialists that are based across the 13 local policing divisions across the country, and they're best placed to support frontline officers and work with specialist partners in the communities to support victims and bring offenders to justice. And lastly, Tier 3 is the National Domestic Abuse Task Force. We have national teams based in the east, west and north of the country, and they lead on the investigations into high tariff or serial perpetrators. And that's the individuals that we've assessed as presenting the greatest threat of risk and harm to victims and families. And they often move from one location to another and cause harm to the next partner and the next partner. So the task force primary focus is on the perpetrator, and they will look at a lifetime of a perpetrator's domestic relationships and offending history, often stretching back 30 plus years, seeking to build a strong evidential case and prevent further abuse. They also work with local divisions in investigating complex cases, both recent and non-recent, and actually the passage of time is no barrier to seeking justice in Scotland, and we always encourage victims who haven't previously reported to come forward and engage with us. And actually, in one of my previous roles, I led some of the task force investigations as a tactical and as a strategic senior investigating officers. And I always remember that one of the team consistently referred to the work that they did as the Murder Prevention Squad. But that tiered approach is coordinated by the Domestic Abuse Coordination Unit, who are a very small team of officers who work within my national wider public protection business area, and they ensure the development and application of effective national policy and practice across Scotland. But I don't think I can emphasise enough the importance of partnerships here. Partner agencies from across our communities can be called upon to assist us in supporting victims and families, targeting perpetrators, and to contribute to the policing practice, process and procedure. And under the domestic abuse umbrella, there are a number of schemes and processes operating in collaboration with partner agencies at local and national levels to deliver better outcomes for victims across Scotland. Effectively tackling domestic abuse is a priority both for us and for the Fiscal Service, and a consistent and robust approach is essential when dealing with criminal conduct arising from domestic abuse. And we have a joint protocol that tells us how we should respond, how we should investigate and report, and how they should prosecute reports of domestic abuse. We have a national domestic abuse forum that provides partner agencies with a voice and a direct access to the policymakers, and that forum is a platform where partners can raise concerns and effectively contribute to the work to continue to improve the policing response. The Multi-Agency Tasking and Coordination Meeting, or MATAC as it's affectionately known, is a leading example of successful partnership working. It's perpetrator focused, and whilst it's governed by a national framework, it's reflective of locally forged partnerships. And it not only provides a combination of prevention and enforcement, but it presents an environment where members are encouraged to utilise their collectively available resources, which has skills, knowledge and experience to target perpetrators and keep victims and families safe. The MARAC, Multi-Agency Risk Assessment Conference, again another local multi-agency but this time victim-focused meeting where information is shared on high-risk cases of domestic abuse between Police Scotland and all of our partner agencies around the table. The disclosure scheme for domestic abuse in Scotland was launched nationally on the 1st of October 2015, and that provides a formal mechanism for potential victims, family members or concerned member of the public or professional body to make inquiries about an individual they're in a relationship with or who's in a relationship with someone they know, and there's a concern that that individual may be abusive. And there are a number of ways to find out about the disclosure scheme for domestic abuse, including things like podcasts and TikTok events that are on. But the primary purpose of that is to prevent repeat offenders continuing their known abusive behaviour by empowering new partners to make an informed decision about their relationship. And since it's launched, we've processed over 16,000 applications to the scheme, and we've delivered in partnership 9,000 disclosures. Currently, domestic abuse is absorbing 20% of operational frontline officers' availability, and we know that's the tip of the iceberg. So prevention has to be key. Police Scotland has a function to play in primary, secondary and tertiary prevention, and we'll always respond to calls for service, but we need to contribute to societal change. And our public messaging campaigns are designed specifically to do that, to target perpetrator behaviours, and the Don't Be That Guy campaign last year was the start of a 3-year coordinated campaign to tackle behaviours and the root cause. So all of that prevention activity is ongoing, and we have a training programme, Domestic Abuse Matters, which commenced in December 2018 and trained over 14,000 officers and staff to recognise that domestic abuse isn't always physical or violent, that it's often psychological, disempowering, it isolates victims and removes them from the support of family and friends, which can have the most devastating impact. And additionally, we have domestic abuse champions across the force who are there to uphold the key principles of the training programme. When there's a death,
you've got a couple minutes, just a couple minutes, okay?
All right. Whenever we have a death in Scotland that's confirmed as domestic related, the initial circumstances instruct a 7-day review. If the 7-day review comes in with concerns about our response to previous incidents, there will then be a full review undertaken by a detective superintendent with a tailored terms of reference. But what that does is it's a single agency review. So I have to rely on voluntary involvement from our partner organisations so that we can all, there will undoubtedly be learning from domestic homicide reviews for everybody. And the purpose of that review is to identify organisational learning. And any recommendations for that are included and disseminated both across the force and with our partners who have involved themselves in that. But in Scotland currently there's no statutory framework that supports a multi-agency review or mandates involvement by any of the partners. So just to conclude, every time we do have a domestic homicide, every instance will be subject of a real intensive scrutiny and an internal review, and it will come back to my desk, and I'm probably the worst person for it to land with because I'll ask a million questions because I'll anticipate what Marsha and others will ask me. But we do recognise the value of including our partners in this process, both statutory and voluntary. Again, undoubtedly learning for every organisation, but it's only by acting together. We can't police our way out of this, so it's only by acting together that collectively we can make a difference to prevent domestic homicide and prevent the tragic loss of life that we see on an annual basis here. Thanks, Marsha.
Thank you, Sam. Really appreciate your time. And Jillian, good to see you in the background. I hear that Kirsty's with us and has a camera. Oh, that's wonderful. So Kirsty, I'm not going to repeat your intro. I'm just going to warmly welcome you and thank you for joining us today.
And thank you. I didn't actually hear your intro because I got booted out just as I was going to come on. So I'm hoping I can stay on today.
I believe it was one you gave us, so I hopefully didn't make anything up.
All right. Okay, brilliant. Thank you. And thank you for inviting me. And it means a lot. And it's a great opportunity for me to learn from this and hopefully you to learn from my experience. I just want to say my mum's on today. So hello, Mum. I love you. So my name's Kirsty. I'm sister of Dawn. And I'm going to talk to you about Dawn's journey through the criminal injustice system, victim blaming, and my observations of domestic homicide reviews and the domestic abuse sector. I might be a bit graphic at times, so if you have to mute me, please do. Dawn was 39 years old when she was killed by the man she had known and been married to for 20 years. Dawn ended the relationship. He had not given her permission to do so. She died as a result of severe blood loss. My understanding, she died from a lack of professional curiosity, a lack of awareness and training, and she died when a safety partnership worked against her. When the police came at 2 a.m. to tell us that she'd been murdered, our mum let out a wailing sound that I had never heard before, and I never wished to again. Dawn was dead and he had killed her. And she died on the floor of their family home that night. 6 months before she died, she reported his behaviour to the police. His threats of suicide, his stalking, his controlling behaviour, her hiding knives for fear he would use them. 6 weeks before she died, she was arrested by the police. She was cautioned and advised to go and sort her life out. Then she was subjected to the cruelness and the shit show of jumping through petrol-soaked, flaming social services hoops. She was on her knees, and those experiences broke her. Then she was killed. And even after he had slain my sister, comments from professionals echoed the "he's a nice guy" narrative. And as for the domestic homicide review, it identified grooming of professionals, and in addition to this, that the awareness of coercive and controlling behaviour was in its infancy. But hey, this was in 2016, and that was a long time ago, and lessons were learned yesterday, and things have moved on, right? But be honest, how often do we hear lack of training and awareness in case reviews today? And lessons learned, a familiar phrase throughout domestic homicide reviews, and quite frankly, it's a ridiculous statement, because if we had learned the lessons, we wouldn't still be having the homicides, would we? And if we're going to use lessons learned, then prove it. Keep focusing on the ones that we save, because this is progress, and more homicide prevention advocacy is required. Defining a situation before you gain the facts will remain catastrophic to any victim. For a victim of abuse, every decision made will be about survival. The evidence of abuse is all there, and we just have to widen our lens. It's not simply enough to identify learning. It's not enough to just make recommendations. If process over purpose isn't keeping women alive, then we need to change the process. And more importantly, put the safety of victims at the heart of our re-education. Let's face it, we all have prejudices. And it's our role as decent human beings to identify them and educate ourselves. Because prejudice can include preconceived ideas. But prejudice is the barrier to critical thinking. Victim blaming is lethal. Poor judgment, in my opinion, is simply reckless. If we have to ask ourselves if our advice or behaviour would be acceptable to us shoe on the other foot scenario, then we are woefully shy of meeting the target of meeting victims with respect, dignity and positive regard. When the perpetrators are made invisible, when the actions and the behaviours aren't understood, when the focus is on the victim to go and sort their life out, it will result in death or serious injury. I do not say that Dawn was murdered, because the killer was acquitted, not guilty of murder. And during the criminal trial, we heard from experts on how, in all probability, the fatal injury to Dawn was inflicted by the perpetrator from behind. The first time I'd sat in a courtroom was the first time I came to know what he had done to her. His punishment for her ending the relationship. I understood why, in the morgue that day, her body looked the way it had. And through faded, greasy handprints on the separating glass, the body of my sister lay under a sheet wearing what appeared to me to be a 16th century ruff around her neck. Clearly, she wasn't wearing a ruff around her neck. And the trauma made my brain refuse to accept what my eyes had seen. She died from an incised wound to the neck, a 13-centimetre wound, severing her carotid artery jugular and windpipe. She was bruised all over her body. She had incised wounds to her hands and fingers, cuts that sliced through the tendons. The pathologist indicated that these to be defensive marks and injuries caused by her defending herself. The jury took 3 days to decide that the defendant was not guilty of murder and that Dawn had brought this, her death, on herself. The ultimate and final victim blaming blow. Judge and jury set him free. The domestic abuse sector was built from the commitment of women who've experienced or witnessed the pain and trauma of their sisters. I have met some wonderful women working tirelessly in the sector, advocating for victims. I'd like to read a statement on victim blaming by one of those wonderful women, Michelle Blunton of East Surrey Domestic Abuse Service. In 20 years, I don't think I have ever met a survivor of domestic abuse who has not been victim blamed. What this tells us is that we are collectively failing survivors and, even worse, trampling on the memory